Okay, so today we're diving into something, well, pretty crucial in our digital world, and that is hacking.
Yeah.
And, it's not just like a tech term that we hear thrown around. This really affects everyone, like directly. It
Right.
impacts your security, your privacy, everything. I mean, we're talking your bank account,
Yeah.
family photos, all of it.
Uh-huh.
And we've got some great information lined up here to really explore what hacking is all about, who's doing it, why they're doing it, and maybe most importantly for all of us, how we can actually protect ourselves better.
Right.
And I think the first thing we should do is kind of get away from all those like Hollywood, cliches.
Yeah.
Because the truth is, hacking is much more complicated and honestly probably a lot scarier than what we see in the movies.
Yeah, I mean, that image we all have in our minds, right? That the lone hooded figure in a dark room just furiously typing away.
Right, exactly.
That exists, but it's only a tiny part of a much, much bigger and way more sophisticated picture.
Yeah.
At its core, hacking is all about finding those weak points, vulnerabilities in computer systems or networks, and then exploiting those weaknesses to get access that they're not supposed to have.
Uh,
But before we get into all the shady stuff, it's worth pointing out that not every hacker has bad intentions. Sometimes it's purely about research and learning.
right.
It's about figuring out how systems work, where they might break down, and ultimately how to make them more secure.
Oh, I like that. So it's almost like, stress testing a bridge or something. You push
Exactly.
it to the absolute limit to see if it can handle it and where those weak spots might be.
Exactly. Yeah, you want to find those vulnerabilities before someone with, bad intentions does.
Right, exactly. So,
Mhm.
I mean, hacking can be a form of digital exploration in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you're right. I think what keeps most of us up at night is the kind of hacking that's meant to do damage.
Right.
We're talking about things like those massive data breaches we hear about all the time, ransomware attacks, just, general chaos in our digital lives.
Yeah, that's the kind of stuff that makes headlines for sure.
Right. And those attacks, they're not getting any simpler, are they?
No, not at all. The scale and sophistication of these malicious activities, it's really grown exponentially. We're not talking about, some kid in their basement anymore.
Right.
This is often highly organized crime, sometimes even state-sponsored groups, and they have the resources and the know-how to bypass even the toughest security measures.
Wow.
It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's constantly evolving.
So it's not just, kids messing around anymore. This is serious business.
Definitely serious business.
And one thing that I think is interesting here, when you look at the history of hacking, it's not some new thing that just popped up with the internet.
Right.
According to our sources, the roots of hacking actually go back decades.
Yeah, that's right. The word hacking itself started showing up back in the 1970s. Back then, it was mostly associated with, people experimenting with early computer systems, kind of a playful thing.
Right.
But then the 1980s hit, and that's when things really started to shift.
And I think a lot of that had to do with movies,
Yeah.
right? I mean, movies like War Games and Tron.
Oh, absolutely. Those movies, even though they were fictional, they tapped into this growing fear about what could happen if computer technology fell into the wrong hands.
Right?
And I think they planted that seed in the public consciousness, this idea of hacking being a real national security threat.
Uh-huh. And it wasn't just the movies that were raising those concerns. I mean, there was a real event in 1983 that really put the spotlight on hacking.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That was a huge turning point. A group of teenagers, they managed to break into some really sensitive systems, including the Los Alamos National Laboratory, which, handles nuclear research.
Right.
That was a major wake-up call for the government. It showed just how vulnerable even our most critical infrastructure could be to these, well, at the time, new digital threats.
It must have been a shock. I mean, we're talking about teenagers breaking into a top-secret government facility.
I know, right? And that incident, it really led to the first federal laws in the U.S. that specifically targeted computer crimes. It was a shift from seeing hacking as just, curious kids messing around to a very serious national security issue.
Yeah, from tinkering to a top-level threat.
Exactly.
And then, of course, the internet came along and, well, I imagine that changed everything.
Oh, it completely revolutionized the game. The internet connected everything and everyone in a way that had never been seen before,
Huh.
and that created a massive, almost limitless landscape for hacking. Suddenly, there were millions, billions of potential targets, and the opportunities for exploitation just exploded.
Right.
And that's really when we start to see these different categories of hackers emerge, the ones that we still talk about today.
Okay, so let's talk about those categories. We have four main types of hackers that we're going to break down here.
Okay.
And, I think we should start with the ones that most people think of when they hear the word hacking, and those are the black hat hackers. So what makes a black hat hacker?
Well, it all comes down to intent. Black hat hackers, they're driven by malicious motives. Their goal is to exploit weaknesses for personal gain, whether that's financial profit, stealing credit card numbers, selling data, or just to cause disruption and sow chaos, like with ransomware attacks or defacing
Right.
websites. They're basically the digital equivalent of thieves and vandals.
So they're the ones behind all those data breaches that we hear about all the time. I mean, the ones where millions of people have their information stolen.
Yeah, that's them.
Hmm.
And they're also the ones behind ransomware attacks that can cripple businesses or even shut down critical infrastructure.
And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the white hat hackers.
Right.
Now, these are the good guys,
Yeah.
right?
They are, yeah. They're the ethical cybersecurity professionals.
Okay.
And they use the same skills and knowledge as black hat hackers, but they use them with permission from the organizations they're working with.
Uh-huh.
Their goal is to find security weaknesses before the bad guys can exploit them.
So they're basically hired to think like the criminals in order to stop them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're like a digital security team trying to anticipate and prevent attacks before they happen.
I like that. So they're using offensive techniques for defensive purposes.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Okay, now there's another group that's a little bit harder to define, and those are the gray hat hackers. Where do they fit in?
Yeah, gray hats are interesting. They operate in a kind of ethical gray area, as you might guess from the name.
Right.
They might poke around in systems without permission, but they're not usually trying to cause harm.
Right. Yeah.
Often they'll find a vulnerability and then report it to the organization, maybe even publicly, without actually doing any damage.
So it's almost like a vigilante approach to cybersecurity, right?
Yeah, kind of. They're trying to expose weaknesses, but they're not playing by the rules.
Right, and that's what makes them so tricky. It's hard to say if they're good or bad.
Exactly. They blur the lines.
Then finally we have the hacktivists. These are the ones with the cause, right?
Right. Hacktivists, they use their hacking skills to push for social or political change.
Okay.
They often target governments or corporations that they see as doing something wrong.
And I imagine groups like Anonymous and WikiLeaks would fall into this category.
Absolutely. They're classic examples of hacktivism. They use hacking to disrupt operations or release information in an attempt to, well, make a statement or expose something they think the public needs to know.
So it's not always about personal gain or even about causing damage. Sometimes it's about ideology.
Exactly. There are a lot of different motives behind hacking.
Okay, so we've talked about the different types of hackers, but let's shift gears a little bit and talk about what they're actually going after.
Sure.
What are some of the devices and systems that are most vulnerable to hacking?
Well, I think it's safe to say that hackers, no matter what their motives are, they're usually going to look for the easiest targets.
The low-hanging fruit, so to speak.
Exactly. They want to exploit the systems with the weakest security. And unfortunately, a lot of the devices that we use every day, they're pretty easy targets.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Either because of how they're designed or because people aren't careful enough about protecting them.
Now, you mentioned earlier that smartphones are a common target, and you specifically pointed to Android devices.
Right.
Could you talk a little bit more about why Android phones might be more vulnerable?
Yeah, so Android is open source, which means that the code that makes it work is available for anyone to see and tinker with.
Okay.
And while that's great for developers and for people who want to customize their phones, it also means that it's easier for hackers to find and exploit vulnerabilities in the code.
Right, because they can see exactly how everything works.
Exactly. Plus, Android is the most popular mobile operating system in the world, so if a hacker can find a way to exploit a weakness in Android, they can potentially target millions of devices.
Sounds like, if you're a bank robber, you're going to go after the bank with the weakest security.
Exactly.
And it's not just our phones that are at risk anymore, right? I mean, we have all these smart devices, these Internet of Things devices like smart speakers and thermostats, even refrigerators that are connected to the internet now.
Right. The IoT, the Internet of Things, it's really expanded the attack surface for hackers.
And a lot of these devices, they're not designed with security as the top priority, are they?
No, not always. Many of them are designed to be cheap and convenient, and that often means that security takes a back seat.
Right.
They might have weak default passwords that people never bother to change, or they might not get regular security updates, which means that they're sitting ducks for hackers.
So even something like a smart speaker could be a way for a hacker to get into your home network.
Absolutely. A compromised smart speaker could be used to eavesdrop on your conversations, steal your data, or even attack other devices on your network.
That's scary.
Yeah, it is. And then you have things like webcams, which are a popular target for a type of malware called a ROT.
Our roadway.
Yeah, a R-rated, which stands for Remote Access Trojan.
Okay.
And it's basically a piece of software that lets a hacker take control of your computer remotely.
Oh, wow.
So if they infect your computer with the RAT, they can turn on your webcam and microphone without you knowing. They can steal your files. They can install more malware. They can even use your computer as part of a botnet.
So they can basically see and hear everything you're doing.
Pretty much, yeah.
That's terrifying. And our home routers, the things that connect all of our devices to the internet, are those vulnerable too?
Yeah, routers are a major target for hackers. If they can get into your router, they can basically see all the data that's flowing through your home network.
So they can see everything you're doing online.
Pretty much, yeah. They can redirect you to fake websites to steal your login information. They can launch DDoS attacks to disrupt your internet service. They can even use your router to mine cryptocurrency.
Crypto mining, that's where they use your computer's processing power to generate cryptocurrency, right?
Exactly. And it can slow down your internet connection and drive up your electricity bill.
So it's like having someone break into your house and steal your stuff without you even knowing.
Yeah, it's a pretty good analogy.
And even with all these sophisticated new threats, it seems like email is still a major way for hackers to get into our systems.
Right. Email is still a very effective attack vector, especially through phishing attacks.
And phishing, that's where they try to trick you into clicking on a malicious link or opening an infected attachment, right?
Exactly. And these emails, they're often disguised to look like they're from a legitimate source, like your bank or a trusted online retailer.
Right.
So you think you're clicking on a safe link, but really you're giving hackers access to your computer or your personal information.
It's like digital social engineering.
That's a good way to put it. They're exploiting human psychology, not just technical vulnerabilities.
Okay, so we've painted a pretty bleak picture here.
Yeah.
It seems like there are threats everywhere. So what can we do about it?
Well, the good news is that there are a lot of things you can do to protect yourself. It's all about being proactive and taking steps to make yourself a less attractive target for hackers.
Okay, so what are some practical things that our listeners can do to stay safe online?
Well, the first thing is to make sure that all your software is up to date.
So we're talking about operating systems on computers and phones, apps, everything.
Everything, yeah. Software updates often include security patches that fix known vulnerabilities, so it's really important to install those updates as soon as possible.
It's like putting on a new coat of armor, right?
Exactly. You're closing up those gaps in your defenses.
And what about passwords? We hear so much about strong passwords, but what does that actually mean? Yeah, strong passwords are crucial. You want to use a combination of uppercase and lowercase letters, numbers, and symbols, and you want to make sure your password is at least 12 characters long.
Okay, that's a good starting point.
And you also want to use a different password for every online account.
So not the same password for your email and your bank account.
Definitely not. If a hacker gets one of your passwords, you don't want them to be able to access all your accounts.
Right, that makes sense.
And if you really want to beef up your security, enable two-factor authentication wherever it's offered.
Two-factor authentication, that's where you need to enter a code from your phone or email in addition to your password, right?
Right. It adds an extra layer of security and makes it much harder for hackers to get into your accounts.
So even if they steal your password, they still can't get in unless they also have your phone.
Exactly.
Okay, what else? What about when we're browsing online? Any tips there?
Yeah, be careful about what you click on.
So no clicking on those tempting ads or links from people you don't know, especially on social media or in emails, yeah. Those can often lead to malicious websites or download malware onto your computer.
And always check the website address to make sure it starts with HTTPS, right?
Right, HTTPS means that the connection is encrypted and more secure.
Okay, that's good to know. What about our devices themselves, our routers and smart gadgets? Any advice there?
Yeah, the first thing you should do is change the default username and password on your router.
The ones that come preset on the device.
Exactly. Those default credentials are often easy for hackers to guess, so you want to change them to something unique and strong.
Right, makes sense.
And you should also do the same for any smart devices that you have, like smart speakers or security cameras.
Okay.
And it's a good idea to install antivirus and anti-malware software on your computers and phones.
To catch anything that might slip through the cracks.
Exactly. Those programs can help detect and remove malicious software before it can do any damage.
And what about using a VPN? Does that help with security.
A VPN, yeah, it can definitely enhance your security and privacy.
And for those who don't know, a VPN stands for.
Virtual private network.
Yep.
And it basically creates an encrypted tunnel for your internet traffic, which makes it much harder for hackers to intercept your data or track your activity.
So it's like putting your internet traffic in a disguise.
Yeah, kind of. It makes it much harder for anyone to see what you're doing online.
Okay, so it sounds like a multi-layered approach to security is really the best strategy.
Yeah, that's right. You want to have multiple layers of protection in place to make it as difficult as possible for hackers to get through.
So keep your software updated, use strong passwords with two-factor authentication, be careful about what you click on, secure your devices, and consider using antivirus software and a VPN.
Exactly.
Now, earlier we talked about white hat hackers, and I know our sources also emphasize the importance of ethical hacking.
Yeah, ethical hacking is a really important part of cybersecurity.
And just to remind everyone, ethical hacking is where security professionals use hacking techniques to find vulnerabilities, but they do it with the permission of the organization, right?
That's right. It's all about finding and fixing security weaknesses before the bad guys can exploit them.
So companies actually hire ethical hackers to try and break into their systems.
Yeah, they do. It might seem counterintuitive, but it's a really smart strategy.
Yeah, it's like giving your security team a real-world test.
Exactly. By simulating real-world attacks, ethical hackers can find vulnerabilities that might have been missed otherwise, and then they can help the organization fix those vulnerabilities before they become a problem.
So they're basically playing the role of the attacker to help the defenders get better.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here today. We've talked about the different types of hackers, what motivates them, what they're after, and what we can do to protect ourselves.
Right.
Any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I think the most important thing to remember is that staying safe online is an ongoing process. It's not a one-time thing. You have to be vigilant, you have to stay informed, and you have to be proactive about protecting yourself.
Yeah, it's like anything else in life, right? You have to be mindful and take care of yourself.
Exactly.
Okay, well, on that note, I'll leave our listeners with this. As we become more and more reliant on technology, the threats are only going to get more sophisticated. So it's up to all of us to understand the risks and take the necessary steps to protect ourselves and our information. The digital world is amazing, but it's also a dangerous place, and we have to be smart about how we navigate it.
Very well said.